All right, thanks, Dave. My name's Ed Leonard. I'm the project manager with Wright Pierce on this project. As Dave said, we've been here a few times before. I think the last time was in August 2017. That was just prior to us submitting the draft report to the State Department of Environmental Protection as well as the Cape Cod Commission. The board at that time voted to authorize us to submit that. We did so last summer, got comments, addressed those comments in conjunction with the town, and submitted the final report in December of 2017. So tonight we're going to talk about a little bit of why we need the plan, just a little bit of a refresher on things from the past, a refresher on the alternatives we considered, a quick summary of the recommended plan, and then talk about costs and next steps, as Dave said. So just by way of definitions, the acronym for this is CWRMP. It's a Comprehensive Water Resources Management Plan. And the purpose of the plan is to identify water quality needs, to identify solutions to address problems with water quality, to recommend approaches to solve those problems, identify costs, funding, and financing mechanisms to implement those improvements. The other acronym that you may have heard a lot is WQAC, which is the Water Quality Advisory Committee. This is a group of town residents and volunteers that were appointed by the Board of Selectmen over time. They represent the different organizations that are shown on the screen. We had dozens of meetings with the Water Quality Advisory Committee over the years that we've been working on this project. The CWRMP started in February 2011 and was completed in December 2017. And there was a numerous year pause in the middle related to waiting on some reports, technical reports that we needed from the Massachusetts Estuaries project in order to complete our work. So the town has considered wastewater management many times over the years. In the past, these efforts were focused primarily on the historic village and the town neck area where there's constraints related to on-site disposal. Those plans were never acted upon in a town meeting, or they were acted on and were not approved for moving forward in town meeting due to high cost at that time and concerns about sewer-induced growth. Since that time, the grant programs have gone away. Some of the growth did occur anyway, and now we have, over the past 10, 15 years, the state has been focused on nutrient enrichment in coastal estuaries as well as freshwater ponds. So the town over the years has either appropriated monies or secured grant funding for numerous aspects of the CWRMP project. Those total $785,000. Not all of it's been expended. Some is just appropriated but unspent. The good news for the town of Sandwich is 62% of that was grant. As Dave mentioned, we've made numerous presentations to the board. These are, I believe, recorded, so they're available for folks to take a look at the specific topics that were presented at that time. The last two were funding approach items that Bud and John Giorgio from KP Law presented in November 2017 and February 2018. So the CWRMP is a water quality focused plan. It's not a wastewater plan. It looks at basically all sorts of water. Drinking water, whether it's public drinking water from the Sandwich Water District or private drinking water wells. We looked at freshwater ponds, and we looked at coastal waters. And we assessed those in conjunction with a number of what we call drivers. Why do we need to make changes? So one of them is Sandwich's local comprehensive plan, which identified several key areas of town where economic development was desired. The marina, the industrial park, South Sandwich Village, historic village. There are drivers from the Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, that are related to surface water protection, freshwater and coastal water, as well as drinking water protection. The state has Zone 1 and Zone 2 wellhead protection areas, which have specific requirements about what can be sited in those locations. We have the Massachusetts Estuaries project, which is a collaboration between DEP and UMass Dartmouth. They produce numerous technical reports for all the watersheds across Cape Cod and southeast Massachusetts, with the goal of trying to establish the amount of nitrogen that was resulting in the coastal eutrophication. And the last driver is the Cape Cod Commission. They had a 208 plan, which I believe was last revised in the 80s. It was recently updated and began in 2013, completed in 2015. And just this past year, they did part 2 of that, which is the implementation plan. So DEP, Cape Cod Commission, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency are all pushing Cape Cod towards addressing these issues. Did you have anything you want to say on MEP?
Yes, and just the precursor to this entire project was the Mass Estuaries project, and that goes back to approximately late 1990s, early 2000. There was a lot of talk of county-wide wastewater treatment and the issues of wastewater county-wide. There was a lot of concern about an MWRA coming to the Cape, and we had approached the Selectman at that time to say, well, the MEP program establishes the science to determine what we need to do. And that's why that program started back then, was really to get a grasp of what issues we had in the town of Sandwich relative to wastewater nutrient loading in our estuaries to establish this whole project. So that's just a little history of the precursor to this entire project.
So the two biggest drivers for Sandwich are watersheds and TMDLs, and I'll define what both of those are. A watershed is kind of an imaginary line that outlines where a drop of water would go if you put it on the ground or in the ground. So a drop of water from here ends up in Cape Cod Bay. Sandwich has 19 total watersheds. The green outlined ones go to Cape Cod Bay. The yellow outlined ones go to the canal. The red outline ones go to Nantucket Sound. These are all delineated by MEP and the Commission over the years. Of those, 9 are entirely on Joint Base Cape Cod, and the town has no control over those. 4 are in the north and are not nitrogen sensitive, which we found out in 2015 when Mass Estuaries project presented to the town on those watersheds. Unfortunately, 4 or 5 watersheds in the south-facing embayments are nitrogen sensitive. And because they are, MEP and DEP prepared TMDL studies, total maximum daily load. And that's essentially the threshold that the water body can assimilate without deteriorating. So it's like the rating of a pickup truck. If it's a 1-ton pickup, you can't put 2 tons in it. That's essentially what a TMDL is. With nitrogen being, and TMDLs are something that are often affixed or required to be addressed through either some kind of permit or consent order or administrative order. It's typically something that's enforceable once the agency decides to enforce it. From a nitrogen perspective, this is the 3-bays watershed, but it's pretty typical of a lot of the Cape Cod watersheds, is 2/3 or more is related to wastewater. There's plenty of sources, fertilizer, home fertilizer, golf course, stormwater, any runoff. There's some that comes from the atmosphere, but the single largest source is wastewater. Everybody produces wastewater, every parcel in town. If you have a non-sewered home, which basically everybody does in Sandwich, the drain pipe goes to the septic system, stuff settles out in the septic tank, you get it pumped out, that's called septage, that goes to a treatment facility. The stuff that doesn't settle flows to the leach field, that's called leachate, that goes to the groundwater and eventually ends up in a pond or the bay or an estuary. If you are connected to a sewer, it's called sewage, it goes to a treatment plant and eventually ends up in a surface water. A typical household in Sandwich produces 65,000 gallons of effluent a year. So, and this is applicable for businesses, industry, restaurants, etc. So we did a needs assessment. Current, kind of a big number here, 1.7 million gallons of water a day in Sandwich as wastewater. We looked at growth in town, and in the future, that number we projected to be 2.2 million gallons a day. We compared those current and future wastewater flows to what we call the different categories of need. So sanitary conditions where there might be bacteria or failing septic systems. We looked at public and private drinking water protection, pond and coastal estuary protection. We call convenience and aesthetics when people have either tight tanks like this building or mounded systems like you see a lot in the historic village, and as well as economic development as outlined in the local comp plan. So based on all those factors, we estimate about 500,000 gallons a day under current flow should be managed in a different fashion than on-site systems in order to meet the goals outlined in the plan. And in the future, that number would be 900,000 gallons a day. So that's about 30% of current, 43-ish% of future. So conclusions from the needs assessment: there is not a need, there's not a need for, nor is there a proposal for a townwide sewer system. There's no proposal for an MWRA type facility for Sandwich. The needs in town do vary by where you're standing in Sandwich. In South Sandwich, because those are in the south-facing watersheds, the primary need is related to nitrogen, but there's also some pond protection and economic development associated with South Sandwich Village and some other parcels down that way. In mid-Sandwich, which would basically be between the industrial park and Route 6, the needs are more water supply protection, pond protection, and a little bit of economic development. And as you get into North Sandwich, or basically north of Route 6, it's still pond protection, economic development, but also expensive septic systems. So the plan calls for a targeted system, small system, to meet the town's objectives. We looked at a host of alternatives. We met with the Water Quality Advisory Committee over about 10 meetings. We looked at things on a watershed by watershed approach and combined those into what we called composite townwide plans. We compared those townwide plans. We utilized different management tools, so we looked at a combination of structural things you would build, versus non-structural things, which are regulatory in nature to try and reduce the sources of nitrogen and any pollutant to surface water. The things in regular fund are considered traditional, so like a sewer. We looked at things that are non-traditional, like alternative toilets and nutrient credit trading. The items in bold are the things that we assembled into our plan, so we're calling it a hybrid plan of traditional, non-traditional, structural, non-structural. So that's the hybrid plan reference. The committee agreed on a number of broad principles. We need to meet known or anticipated TMDLs, address the identified wastewater management needs, touch the fewest number of parcels possible, minimize the amount of parcels that are impacted, eliminate the Forestdale and Oak Ridge school treatment plants and combine those into the new system, but upgrade the high school treatment plant because it's really kind of far away from the core of what we ended up with for a system. Utilize regional approaches in the shared watersheds in the southern, south-facing embayments. Provide focused early action where we could for the key areas identified in the local comp plan, and provide for growth consistent with what is in the comp plan, but not sewer-induced growth. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Water Quality Advisory Committee selected Plan B versus Plan A. The primary difference between those two is the use of a non-traditional approach of nitrogen credit trading to get the best bang for the buck by working collectively with other watershed towns. I'm not going to get into the details of that right now, but it's a fairly unique advantage that Sandwich has given where the town sits in the context of the watershed.
And just a quick note, the example of that is the recent IMA that we set up with Mashpee, the intermunicipal agreement with the town of Mashpee to look at this issue, recognizing that there.
Barnstable.
I'm sorry?
And Barnstable.
And Barnstable, yes, thank you. And knowing that there is a portion of South Sandwich groundwater flow containing our nitrogen that is flowing into their embayments on the south side.
So this is a figure from the CWRMP. We're proposing a phased implementation plan. So 3 phases spread out over 60 years so that the different phases, the debt would be retired from each phase before the next phase started, so that you're not, ideally, you're not or minimally stacking debt on the projects. It would include sewer service in phase 1 for the parcels in red, which are Forestdale School, Public Safety Complex, South Sandwich Village, Industrial Park, Historic Village. Green is phase 2, which are basically adjacent places to phase 1 that are also near environmentally sensitive areas like Peters Pond, Snake Pond, primarily focused in the south-facing watersheds. Also, Town Neck is included in phase 2. Phase 3, we hope not to have to do. It's something DEP requires, that you have a contingency plan in the event that the non-traditional approaches don't work, quote unquote, don't work, because they aren't traditional. And phase 3 would consist of a lot of the densely developed neighborhoods in the south-facing embayments. Where a part of the plan includes water main extensions to several neighborhoods that have that are currently private wells that have increasing nitrate, which is a health concern at certain levels. We also are including stormwater BMPs. BMP stands for Best Management Practice. So it's changing from swales that go straight into ponds to some kind of buffer, either vegetated swale. Pre-treatments to take out any of the road sand, salt, runoff, fertilizer, things like that before it goes into the pond. And it includes nitrogen credit trading. So this plan, the sewer portion of this plan only touches 1,800 parcels out of the 8,800 parcels or so in town. So it's fairly focused. The cost for phase 1 are $86 million. The wastewater piece of that is $70 million. The water main extensions are close to 15, and the stormwater pieces are just over $1 million. So this kind of gets to the question, one of the questions from the Finance Committee. In order to determine what this would cost somebody in Sandwich, not just the big number, but what does it cost to a typical home, we have to make a number of assumptions and develop a financing scenario. So we use the following assumptions: that it would be a traditional publicly owned treatment works built with a conventional design, bid, build, delivery system. So the town would lead it, and it would collect revenue to pay the debt from the users. We assumed a mixture of loans. So DEP does have a 0%, which is called their enhanced SRF program. It has a number of requirements, including not allowing sewer-induced growth, not being under any kind of consent order, and the project is largely nutrient related. So the town would comply with those components. It's not an unlimited funding source, so DEP also has their traditional SRF program, which is at 2%. Obviously, it's a subsidized rate. And then we used a fourth piece of municipal general obligation bond at 4%. We did include a MassWorks grant as a placeholder. There's been some discussions with folks in town, SEIC in the town, about the possibility to assemble a MassWorks grant, so we included that as a placeholder. We assumed that the debt would be paid by a combination of users and taxpayers, taxation, or the Water Infrastructure Investment Fund. If you take the 50-50 and 100, it aggregates out to about 25% by user and 75% by taxation or Wiff, which is what Bud had presented to you guys in previous meetings. Septage pumping cost would continue to be 100% by by the homeowner, the non-user, and wastewater system operation and maintenance user fees would be 100% by the users. And then the program costs, things related to administering the program by town staff, dealing with nitrogen credit trading, dealing with stormwater improvements, pond management, those would be by taxation or Wiff. When you boil all that down, that results in an estimated sewer user rate of $1,320 per year for an average home, plus $267 a year for a taxation impact for that same average home. We played around with how much was paid by taxation versus user, and what we tried to arrive at was something that was reasonably consistent between sewer user and non-user. Clearly, so what we're showing here is a sewer user would pay obviously no cost for a septic system because they wouldn't have one. They would have their sewer user fee, their tax component at a total of approximately $1,600 a year. A non-user has their septic system, the taxation piece, to a total of $1,267 a year. Arguably, a sewer user has some beneficial value, and that's why the fee is higher. So these are all part of the financing scenario. These are things that the town can massage and work through with its finance committee and finance staff to come up with something that's a best fit for the town. So these are screenshots of the package that you have that was in the material posted with the agenda. And I wanted to put them up here so you can see them side by side. And I'm just going to go quickly and Bud can address the questions. So this is for the phase 1 project, $86 million. It assumes a 30-year note at 2%. We're showing all 4 figures here show fiscal year 2020 to 2054. So in this case, there's no debt in the early years. This is based on level payment. So it's debt service, principal and interest, less the amount paid, the 25% paid through betterments, and then the balance is through taxation. That's $274 a year, which is basically the same as what I just showed, the 267 on the previous slide. And obviously that is consistent through the years because it's a level debt payment. If you were to do a similar approach with Wiff, if you used a 3%, you have the same loan terms. It's this 30-year loan, 2% interest. These are the projected revenues based on 3%. Each year those values increase based on the town's assessed value increasing. This would be the debt payment. This is how much comes in the door from Wiff versus minus what goes out for debt. So there's some negative cash flow here, but you can see the running tally. This is the cumulative as you go down, doesn't ever go negative. And in this case, the Wiff cost to the average taxpayer is less than the debt costs as a bonded project. So these would start at 274 to 170 for the average homeowner for an $86 million project. So November, February, there were presentations about what I'll call a partial phase 1. And this is also a project that was discussed for numerous years. We called it Interim Wastewater Solutions. There's been some public-private partnership discussions about essentially this project. Constructing a treatment facility near the industrial park, at the end of the industrial park. It would serve selected areas, so it's not the full phase 1 service area, it's a subset. It's not the full phase 1 cost, it's a subset, but it's got similar assumptions in terms of how it's financed. And if you compare these, again, it's got the same fiscal years, it's got the same assumptions on the notes. This comes out to about $113 per year for a debt exclusion-based approach. and about the same for a Wiff-based approach. And this is for a $30 million project. So that was fast, but I just wanted to identify the similarities and differences between those and paint the picture on the capital cost versus the annual cost. So we can do more in questions on that.
That one on the right is $75 million, and this one's a 30, is that right?
Nope, these are both the $30 million project, with the table on the left being a debt exclusion taxation-based approach, and the table on the right being the Wiff-based approach. So ultimately, this comes down to a combination. The CWRMP is essentially a combination of want-to-dos and have-to-dos. And the have-to-dos are going to be the things that are enforced by the regulators when they do. So it's, we have a long-term plan that has drivers, some of which are goals set by the town, some of which are requirements set by regulators. Over time, and these are not intended as threats, these are just what happens if we don't do something. Ponds and coastal estuaries will continue to decrease. Coastal water quality will progressively decrease. The town won't fulfill its vision on the local comp plan. Over time, there'll be issues with nitrates and contaminants of emerging concern, like Silent Springs is identified in locations on Cape Cod, associated with public and private drinking water. And there's always the potential for either the state, regional government, or federal government to do something to compel action. Now, Sandwich isn't alone in this. All the other towns in the Cape have the same sort of ambiguous regulatory framework right now. There's been a couple of editorials of late that have been supportive of towns in general's effort to keep wastewater discussions moving and progress made. So there's never going to, in my career, I've never had an experience where a regulator comes in, says, you guys aren't doing anything, we're going to do it, and sends you a bill. That would never, it wouldn't happen. They would just say, okay, town, you need to tell us what you're going to do and when, and how you're going to fund it, give us dates, and set your course. So these things may happen. In the current political environment, they may not happen immediately, but they may happen soon. May or may not, sorry. They may not happen immediately, but they may happen eventually. So ultimately, it's, again, the balance of what do we want to do and what do we have to do. So to that end, there are things I think that we need direction or support from the board. And these fonts are really screwy. We, I think, need some direction on whether we're going to continue to put forward numbers, costs, outreach for the full phase one project or a partial phase one. We should look to get some direction on the project delivery method, whether it would be a conventional approach or a public-private partnership approach. Would like to affirm a date by which, if we're looking at the local comp plan, when do we want a treatment plant to fulfill those goals? Because it's going to take 4 or 5 years to build it from whenever the decision is to say go. We should look for supported direction to develop short-term plans for the school treatment plants, because they don't have infinite life. It's, you know, this is the kind of thing that has a 5 to 10 more years probably before it needs some investment. And we should look to get all the treatment and disposal sites identified in the CWRMP set aside by the board so that they don't inadvertently get used for something else. There's a whole host of other things that could happen that don't have to happen, that ideally would happen before a town meeting vote for a substantial project. These are all things that are needed before we can put shovels in the ground. Some pond studies, some supplemental field work. We need to go through a MEPA review process commission review process. And then there's some of those non-traditional, non-structural items to work through, policies, ordinances, things like that. And then public outreach. The town was successful in getting a Delta grant from the commission to help frame out an outreach program. The goals of that program was to increase stakeholder knowledge of water quality issues and an understanding of the need for funding, with the buildup being getting to a town meeting vote. So you probably don't want to start too early, but you want to have a comprehensive approach to it. And these are just the high points of what was recommended in this 70-some-odd page plan. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm sure there's questions on